So I think you have concentrated on discussing what I call trusts, foundations, and funds. So there's that one chunk. There is also a discussion of social enterprise and earned income. There's also a discussion of the sponsorship. Now, the bit that I think perhaps we need to add a few comments is the first chunk of trusts, foundations, and funds. Most of the private sources of grants fall under this category: trusts, funds, or foundations. And all of them effectively are based on an administrative and legal structure that has three elements. It's important to understand that for strategic reasons. And the legal structure is that of a trust. Every country calls it different, but effectively you have three elements. You have a benefactor, a trust, and a beneficiary. So the benefactor is, as you've been discussing, who's giving the money. And you would find that there's even that can be classified from private individual philanthropists to governments to public subscription to companies to people leaving legacies in their will. All of those are all benefactors. But the reason why they are grant-making bodies is because it hasn't just happened once and it's disappeared. It's because you have this admin or legal structure called technically a trust, so that it continues to happen in the future. Yeah? So the benefactors, one category. Then you have the trust. The trust is the legal body or administrative body. And the role of the trust is that it looks after the benefaction. So the benefaction is the gift. And that trust can be independent trustees. It may be a company. It may be an organization. They manage the benefaction, the money. And they hold it in trust for the third category, that is the beneficiary. So you have benefactor, trust, beneficiary. And the beneficiary is the applicant who says, I want this money. And this framework is actually a very old one in European legal system. And almost every EU country have a version of it. They might call it something else. Yeah? And hopefully you will recognize it from any private grant-making source that you've had dealings with. Now, another element of classification, let's go back to the benefactors. Some of these benefactors have been dead for 200 years. So can I ask you, do you know in your countries of a trust or foundation that is over 100 years old? If not in your country, any that you may know that may be over 100 years old. Just mention the name of the foundation. Which one? Rockefeller?
Fondation de France.
Foundation of France? Gertrude? Stiftung, it's a foundation. Macmillan Foundation. Aga Khan Foundation. Now, many of these are indeed over 100 years old. Now, that gives us a hint as to the nature of the benefaction. So the benefaction is a gift, and it can come in many forms. It's a gift of cash or property. So the ones that last long are the ones that the original gift was either landed property or property in shares. So the grants being made out is based on the income over the years. So we now talk about somebody mentioned Heshima. I think it was another organization was funded by Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation was mentioned. I mentioned it. Oh, you mentioned it. Ford Foundation. That's from Ford, the motor car. In England, some of you must have drunk Cadbury hot chocolate. Yeah, do you like Cadbury hot chocolate? Yeah, it's the Cadbury family. They were Quaker Christians, and they created the Cadbury Foundation. To this day, it's giving out grants. The Rockefeller Foundation. Now, in the past 20 years, there's new foundations like that with legacies of either shares or property and people living on the income. Can you think of any foundations that are 20 years old since year 2000? Sorry, Clinton. Bill Gates, Clinton.
Fondation Raja.
Raja, I don't know them. Bush, well, I won't take money off him, but but yes, there's many recent. Do you know of any recent, maybe African foundations? Mo Ibrahim. Who else? Dangote.
I believe there's one in Nigeria called Tony Emololu.
Tony Elumelu.
Fondation Ufweboigny in
Fondation Ufweboigny. Okay, so you can see. Sorry, Breeze. So you can see that structure is being now copied across the world. And it's one of the best structures because it's about ongoing income over generations, yeah? So that's that element of the nature of the benefaction. But some of those foundations and trusts, the money is through public subscription. Maybe a fundraising event and the public donate, but it goes into a trust, which is managed rather than just spent in one go. In the UK, we have a very successful one called Comic Relief. So every 2 years, they raise lots of money. It goes to a pot, and it's discussed that way. Now, another classification to look at, which is relevant where we're sitting here in Eastern Europe, is that some of these foundations operate at a global level, some international, some regional, some national, some local. So what's the difference between global and international? Global are the ones that operate almost everywhere on earth, like Rockefeller. They operate almost everywhere. International are the ones that operate in many continents, like Bill Gates or Clinton. Yeah? Regional are the ones that operate within a continent. And here in Central Eastern Europe, can you think of any regional foundation that would be relevant to you? Mention the name.
The Open Society
Open
Foundation.
Society, it's one of the most important ones. That's the George Soros one. Yeah. So the George Soros family of foundations is very relevant to Central and Eastern Europe as a regional one. And although they operate in Africa as well. Yeah?
And Visegrad.
Okay.
For around the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, and this area, Visegrad. Okay.
So then you need to bear in mind that the country you are in, if you are in Croatia, there might not be many national ones, but there might be regional ones that are relevant to you. So if you come to the national one, I will not ask for examples, but one typical type would be the national lotteries of each country. They tend to just focus on national. And then there's even local. There are some trusts, some of them very wealthy, but they just focus in a locality, maybe in just one municipality. So you need to do the sort of research along those lines. By the way, in Austria and in almost every other country, there would be publications, a book you can buy, or an online facility you can subscribe to that has the list of the different foundations, as it were. Now, bringing it then back to foundations that perhaps work on development in Africa. So you will find that all foundations will make a decision as to what their priorities are. So they have a sectoral theme. Bill Gates does health. Tony Emelumo does business.
Mo Ibrahim.
Mo Ibrahim does governance and education. So all of them have thematic areas. As you guys were discussing, you will be wasting your time to go to someone and say, I want to interest you on a topic which they said they're not interested in. It's just a waste of time. We have an important one also in Austria. Yeah.
The OFID fund is also very important.
Okay.
Yeah.
So find the thematic area, the geographical area. Also find out how much money they have. Because I'm not saying that you shouldn't apply for money from funds, small funds, but it becomes more difficult if the fund is small. That means the stresses on the demands on it are too high. So find the rich ones. Your chances increases slightly better.
Il faut même demander s'ils financent votre pays.
Oui.
Ouais.
Yeah, exactly. They would have criteria that also says which country they are funding and which country they exclude. So that characterization is important. Now, in recent years, partly due to advocacy by organizations such as Forim, Afford, and others, we're trying to get foundations that already exist or new foundations to say the thematic area itself should be diaspora and development. So now they have thematic area, health, education. So we're saying diaspora and development should be a thematic area by itself. And we have some success. In France, there is a trust like that, whereby the benefactor is the government of France. The trustee managing it is Forim, represented by Brice, and the beneficiaries are diaspora organizations who apply. And the theme is diaspora development. So there's been progress. Now you cannot name very many of those. So I can mention the Forum scheme. In the UK, we have a similar scheme called Common Ground Initiative, run by Comic Relief. Again, they've got money from their own sources, that is public subscription, with additional money from the government. And they manage it, and they give it to African diaspora organizations, as well as other small organizations working in Africa. In Denmark, the Danish Refugee Council had also started something like that, a small one for diaspora to Somalia and Afghanistan in particular. So there's a bit of movement towards this. So in terms of advocacy and lobbying, in our own countries, we should not be shy to lobby for diaspora development grant funds. And the reason why we've linked this training today, fundraising, and the training tomorrow on policy and influencing policy, because in a sense, the skills are very similar. If you are fundraising, you're effectively trying to influence somebody to give you money. If you are doing policy advocacy, you're trying to influence somebody to change policy or to do it in a particular way. So in a sense, it's a set core of skills and understanding that you need to do this. So now we've got the diaspora development sort of grant element established. Another element is this, that is, what about grant funds operating in Africa itself? Do you know of any grant funds that are based and operating in Africa for African projects? No. Do you think there are any? Yeah. But if you are in diaspora and development in Africa, this is it. You now begin to see yourself foot in two places. You need to know what's going on. so that your partners there to be accessing it. I can tell you that there is an African Grantmakers network. Their last meeting was in June. The last meeting was in June in Arusha, Tanzania, and the Afford people were there. So it's a network. It's a well-developed area, and there's a whole number of individual organizations granting the total of millions of pounds a year. And this whole sector is growing. So some of the benefactors now in Africa, they are setting up their own foundations, but they are also giving big chunks of money to existing grant makers. And you have even development agencies in Europe who are contributing to those pots of money. And I'll give you just an example of some of the more vibrant of those grant makers in Africa from a regional perspective. There is the African Women's Development Fund, headquartered in Ghana, very active, been going on for nearly a decade. Started by African women diaspora, mainly from the UK. Decided to go back mainly to West Africa, and it's very active. There is the Kenya Community Development Foundation, which gives out grants. There's Trust Africa. Trust Africa goes across different countries. There is the South African Trust for Southern Africa. Again, in East Africa, there's another one called Akiba Yuhaki Foundation. And I think Afford is working with them. So there's a whole lot of things happening on the ground. The bit that is missing and we need to develop is dedicated diaspora development funds whereby the benefactors are almost entirely African or African diaspora. So we're not there yet. So we need to convince our billionaires to put money not only in their funds, but into independent funds. Yeah? And usually these billionaires is because they become extremely wealthy, and then they spend a lot of time giving it away. With Tony Elumelu, he's the guy behind the UBA Bank. And of course, you know Mo Ibrahim must take the credit as one of maybe 2 or 3 people who brought mobile phones to Africa. Now,
the problem is, with the billionaire is that we never know whether the ethic is respected.
yes.
Whether we have to go to X or we don't know how the person gained
Got their money.
Yes.
Yeah. In some cases, in most cases now, we actually know. We know what we may be that perhaps we don't like it, how they got it. But most of the billionaires who are setting up foundations are clean enough to be out there to declare that here's my foundations. The billionaires whose monies come from more dubious sources are not setting foundations. They are keeping their monies next door in Switzerland.